Observing eye. In commentaries about a dark, unconscious, or unacknowledged side to us all, which results in our living always in the smaller parts of ourselves, forgetting the rest of self at different times, the necessity of increasing consciousness is suggested, so that it begins to embrace the whole circle of everyday life. For that reason, it was noted in earlier teaching that we should get to know every eye in us. It was further added, this is the reason why we are all wrong, out of balance, and cannot grow any further, because we are conscious of only one eye at a time, which we erroneously take as consciousness, as our self. Therefore, we see no contradiction within, and live always in one very small segment at a time. As work memory increases, through the power of self-observation, we begin to distrust whichever particular eye we happen to be in at that moment. When it's said that we do not trust it, we don't quite believe what is being said, what it is thinking, what it is feeling just in that particular moment. If we do not begin to understand that, then any eye which happens to be uppermost within us, any eye that we take as ourselves for that moment, says or does and promises things during its short term of tenure, which later in the day we know nothing about. The mouth writes checks that someone else must honor. In other words, we have to become far more conscious of this rotation of eyes within us, so we can remember what particular eye said when, and what some other eye said shortly thereafter. Otherwise, we shall possess no distinct being, which means that our level of being is constantly shifting, controlled by temporary eyes in any given moment, and we appear to have multiple personalities. What therefore is that thing in us which stands higher than ordinary eyes, and why is it said in Work on Self that we really ought to observe those different eyes in ourselves more closely? The answer is observing eye, which resides within, and if only we could learn to use it, it has a memory of its own, because it stands outside the machinery of those rotating eyes of the carousel. Observing eye views them all, as it were, detached, and stores within its own memory all the various eyes that it observes. That memory is called work memory. Each eye, mechanically arising and taking charge for a moment, has its own memory. However, observing eye has a very different quality of memory, one of perspective that is more inclusive and therefore objective. We can reflect here upon narrowness of outlook, because we can all have some vague recollection of having acted in a particular way and then shortly thereafter acted in a contrary manner. We are often uneasy, and it's therefore not possible to trust anyone that is not at least a little uneasy with themselves. Only when we possess that vague sense of uneasiness about our own contradictions, the things we find incompatible with others in ourselves, that we develop a certain kind of observation, a sort of vague conscious awareness of what our own life is really like. Realizing that we are identified with it and judge ourselves in consequence, according to our habits, culture, religion, and upbringing. The point about observing eye, established through the influence of work, the acceptance and valuation of it, lies in the fact that it can observe you uncritically, without necessarily identifying with anything. It observes you impersonally, observing your personality objectively, remembering what it has observed uncritically, in the absence of any labeling. Personality is composed of different eyes, and is, as it were, turning like a wheel, so that at one moment one eye is uppermost and in charge, at another moment another takes over and assumes control. We have a dim recollection of this already, but always take sides with regard to those observations of ourselves. The establishment of an observing eye, in a work sense, is the emergence within of a level of consciousness above all of those different, ever-changing eyes. Observing I, in the sense of work, does not take sides in anything, merely recording what we are doing and what we are saying at different moments through the action of different eyes. And it does not say that this is better or that is worse. Observing I is not shocked by anything. It is a kind of grandparent in us, however quite pure and simple. P.D. Ouspensky would compare it to a camera that simply captures our psychological state in each moment impartially. He said, observing I must stand outside of personality, stand outside that cage of eyes, the zoological garden that is constantly taking charge in a kind of roster, calling itself I, which we then take as me. The establishment of observing I, he would point out, is something that is very difficult because such observation, such as we maintain during social intercourse, is really based upon one I. A little bit of something observing another, but then criticizing and finding fault with it. Any true observing I, in a work sense, stands outside of all these eyes that take charge. It is therefore on a level above personality. The observing I that work emphasizes, and about which it is stressed should be uncritical, unhindered, and without any acquired moral values, is the most important thing to establish in ourselves if we want to undergo change. Observing I that work speaks of is under the influence of the work itself, falling under that influence later on. However, at first, our task is to establish that impersonal, uncritical observation of ourselves, which means what? It means that if we observe something in ourselves and do not judge whether it's good or bad, we simply see that we, the machine which controls the self, those acquired eyes in us, are doing this or that in a particular moment. They are talking in this way, they are talking in that way. They are feeling this and they are feeling that. No single I in our personality will ever include the whole of ourselves in its consciousness. However, observing I will include the whole of our lives eventually. It would become conscious of all sides of ourselves, having its own uncritical, gentle memory of all the different sides that have gone into making what we've become through time. Certain things in our lives are incompatible with other things, and so, in consequence, we feel conflict and distress about them. For example, to a person with a very narrow outlook, various things become incompatible as a result of that narrow outlook, meaning certain things are judged as being evil in consequence. Suppose, however, that this person becomes broader-minded, then many things that were formerly incompatible begin to find their place, no longer seeming quite as irreconcilable as before. But for observing I, nothing is incompatible because nothing is criticized. So we might say in rather too small a way that observing I is very broad-minded. Most people are sure of many things that they do not possess. All of us likely think that we are broad-minded, and I always dislike it when told that I have to meet someone who is broad-minded. This is no sort of description to give of an individual who desires to come into any sort of work on self. That so-called broad-minded person, yourself included, is probably extremely narrow-minded. So what then does broad-minded mean in a work sense? Observing I, once established, when it observes and records every side of ourselves, is indeed broad-minded. And so unless we come to that relationship of real observing I, which is genuinely uncritical, we will not be able to shift ourselves from where we are, because we will always be on the turning wheel of different and contradictory eyes, which we try vaguely, with a kind of dim consciousness, to reconcile with one another. We have to accept the whole of our lives, all the sides that are dark to us in any moment, all that side that is unconscious in the instance, the very narrow outlook, which of course we all deny having, as the result of our little being, that small, tedious little being which is always quarrelling and objecting, finding fault at every moment. The only cure is to broaden our being, and that means becoming more conscious of the whole of our being, all the I's in us, and to be able to endure the contradictions they all represent. All this is only possible by establishing an uncritical and sincere observing I. Through its memory and through a right relationship to it, we will find that we begin to change the whole picture of ourselves, in our whole idea of ourself. Because we must remember that when we die, at the moment of our material demise, all of our life appears to us with all its contradictions, because it is who we are, and those emotions, all conflicts, confusion, and anything that remains unreconciled in our emotions is imparted to us, to the spiritual realm wherein we next reside. It is sometimes said that people see their whole lives when drowning, or any such near-death experience, and this is not untrue. However, what we have to do is try to see all round ourselves in everyday life before we die. Then, certainly, we'd be unlikely to have the same opinion of ourselves, the same prejudices, and the same buffers. That is the work of observing I, and the task that observing I must fulfill in ourselves little by little. When you have no observing I, when you have no power of separating from what life has made of you, when you take yourself for granted, then you must remember that you have a very small bank balance and are very quickly overdrawn, departing this realm in a most troubled and restless state indeed. What does that mean, to have a small balance? Of course, it has nothing to do with money or material wealth. It refers to our capacity for bearing things without being identified. Suppose one has a very high opinion of themselves, then their balance is quickly overdrawn. If you have a high opinion of yourself, you will become offended and upset. Therefore, your balance will be overturned and equilibrium shattered. You will soon grow negative and even offended. We should not lay up treasure in any ordinary mechanical bank, and are instead told to lay up treasure in heaven, which means on a higher level. If you are filled with your own excellence and merit, are you laying up treasure in heaven? No, you are someone who is easily irritated and may soon find yourself distressed. We have to acknowledge and accept all sides to ourselves, because only through the acceptance and consciousness of all sides of ourselves can we advance at all, as that is exactly what broadens our being. Under the influence of observing I, under the influence of such uncritical self-observation, we begin to disentangle from all sorts of fantastic ideas of ourselves. We break free from exaggerated attributes of virtue and merit that we do not really possess. We certainly become then as little children and grow to understand what the opening words of the Sermon on the Mount truly mean. We then cease to be larger than life and swell our cheeks with pride and vanity. We begin to acquire an entirely new sense of ourselves, a new feeling and some entirely new thoughts. We cease to be the person we have imagined ourselves to be all through our lives, and for this must have a different kind of self-knowledge, and the groundwork changes. Through the influence of observing I, we can be rescued from many dangers, the greatest of which is to crystallize into an idea of ourselves as we grow older. After a time, things begin to become rather fixed in us, as we begin to believe our imagination of ourselves, of the kind of person that we think we are, a good and kind benefactor to all. However, an uncritical observing I, if it is supported properly through a constant feeling and valuation of this work, begins to prevent us from that early crystallization into a certain definite kind of person, which is ultimately false. If we can give value to the work, then we can give value to what observing eye notices about ourselves, which means we shall not be in danger of crystallizing out into what we imagine ourselves to be, into some definite opinion of ourselves, of our own excellence, extraordinary merit, and unexplained values. We are all such tiny and unpleasant creatures that it takes a great deal of self-observation to observe that we are actually quite ridiculous in all of our vanity and pride. Some people tend to believe they have a marvelous gift to bestow upon others, imagining some warm and benevolent benefactance. But what is that precious gift they wish to bestow upon others? Have you asked what you have in yourself that is worth anyone else accepting? After a time in this work, people become more simple in that way, because they really begin to observe themselves instead of imagining that they are what they believe. They begin to see that the gulf between what they imagine and what they are is actually very wide. When this happens, through the constant, uncritical influence of observing eye, their whole relationship to themselves begins to change. All that we have hitherto based our values upon, all our different feelings of superiority over others, all this begins to dissolve, and we cease to build ourselves up on false personality, which is our most dangerous enemy, as it's composed entirely of imagination. Of course, this cannot be done artificially, through mock humility. There is nothing worse. You can go about looking down your nose, while inside you are full of hissing serpents. What the work speaks about, if observing eye is established in us, and we really begin to observe ourselves, how we speak and how we feel, how we think, how contradictory the whole thing is, will then lead to a beautiful experience, because we shall no longer have to keep up the invented person to whom we are subservient. This can only happen through work, because work on self must hold us at certain moments and give strength. No one is allowed in the work, no one is allowed by the work to observe themselves further than they can bear. You may be quite sure that in the atmosphere of work no one will suffer wrongly. A great many have not even begun to observe themselves, and the reason is that they cannot do so. They cannot get beyond their idea of themselves, or rather, they cannot get under their imagination of themselves. Instantly, they begin to feel they are no good, of no importance, and they suffocate. George Gurdjieff would tell his followers that personality has scarcely any right to exist here, and unless someone begins to realize their own nothingness, they can get nowhere. If a person begins to see through the self, through all lies and the inventions of themselves, and if they do this in the atmosphere of work, feeling that by working on themselves it will lead them to a new level of being, then they are safe and will undergo, little by little, a perfectly definite and real transformation of themselves. If, however, they try to do this without the influence of the work behind them, they will get nowhere, and all their observations will be useless, simply leading to quarrels, arguments, and negative emotion. We are all trying to study something that is big, and must realize in this that we are very small.